Alright guys, Murph's here, and today I want to talk about this, a Taurus TX22 chambered in 22 long rifle. This is the competition version, and this is also the latest entry in our Friendly Fire series, the series where I take guns out of my friends' collections in order to remove my personal purchase bias and discuss at the end as to whether or not I would purchase this firearm. So with that, why don't we go ahead and get into a little bit of history. Taurus has existed in one form or another since 1941, producing revolvers once upon a time. And they would get a big boost in the market when Beretta closed down a factory in Brazil that was producing firearms for the Brazilian police and military. Taurus would purchase this factory along with all of its tooling and a lot of its schematics and stuff like that and start producing their own version of the Beretta Model 92 known as the PT92. Now, in 1982, Taurus would open a plant in the United States and would start selling firearms on the American market. Now, I do have to go ahead and admit to a certain bias here. I am not a fan of Taurus products. I never have been. I long ago drew a line above Taurus for my expectations for firearms. This has to do with some historical quality assurance issues that the company has had. Now, that does not mean that I would necessarily fault anybody for purchasing a Taurus product as much as it's just never been my cup of tea. So this is a very interesting episode of Friendly Fire because we are making me evaluate something outside of my realm of interest or that I would even consider to begin with. So now, not only do we get to answer at the end of this as to whether or not I would buy it, but we also get to answer the question as to whether or not my opinion changed about the company overall just based on this selection of one. All right, so with that, why don't we go ahead and get into the features of this particular handgun. We have a 5.2-inch barrel. This is the threaded barrel version, which normally would come with a muzzle nut. However, the owner did not hand this off to me when I grabbed this up. Now, there's another version of the competition model that comes with a compensator pre-installed. This gives you the option to put whatever muzzle device it is that you want to put on the handgun. In this case, the owner has selected to place a silencerco sparrow on this one. This is a suppressor host for him. So we'll talk about that more once we get into the shooting portion of this video. Our sights are 3-dot sights, as you can see right there. The rear sight is adjustable, which is pretty typical of of competition type sights. And we'll talk about these sights more once we get into the shooting portion as well. Now, as we can see here, the slide has been cut back in order to accommodate this optics plate located right here. Now, this is a reversible plate that allows you to mount a wide variety of optics on this particular handgun. Now, one of the great things about moving into the current trend with handguns is the wide availability of optics plates in order to be able to mount electronic sights. Now, what I find interesting about this optics plate is that, as we can see here, this is mounted directly to the barrel, not to the slide. So, especially since this is not a Browning tilting barrel action or anything like that. This is just a straight blowback handgun with a fixed barrel. The sight mounted on this gun would not move as much as it would on a slide. It's not reciprocating back and forth. So ideally, you would have a very stable platform for your optic for faster follow-up shots. Now, of course, in the Friendly Fire series, guys, I review guns in the way that they come to me. So I was not provided an optic for this handgun. I did not get to shoot and evaluate it with an optic, so I'm not entirely sure how it would perform. One thing that I can note, however, standing here looking at it, is that the optic is likely to sit higher than the ability for these sights to be able to co-witness with it, which normally, on at least a combat-style handgun, I would be concerned about it. On a competition-style handgun, I don't think it's as big of an issue. Now, if we come back to the forward portion of the slide here, we can see that we have some slide serrations into the small section that hasn't been scalloped out. I am not a big fan of these. What I found is that I have to grip them very far forward in order to not run my hands into the optics plate as I bring them back. And if I have the suppressor mounted, then I don't really have any space off of the back of the suppressor to be able to grab these front cocking serrations. So I'm not a big fan of this setup. Now, in general, I like front cocking serrations because they're very handy to be able to conduct press checks, and I'm a big fan of press checks, which unfortunately seems to be a hot button topic in the industry right now because there are a lot of people who feel that you're a douchebag if you conduct press checks. However, in my experience, both both personal and observational. I've seen plenty of times where guys have stepped to the line at a course or a competition, presented their firearm, and then had a click, no bang because they didn't make sure that the gun was loaded. They were 100% convinced that they'd already loaded the firearm and didn't check it. That click would be absolutely deafening in a life or death situation. So I consider press checks to be a pretty important function. However, we do have good rear cocking serrations so that you can still conduct your press checks from the rear of the gun should you feel the need to do so. All right, now this is a striker fired system. We'll talk about that more once we get over to the trigger. I just want to go ahead and get that out of the way before I forgot. Now, something to remember about the slide is that it is an incredibly lightweight gun overall, including the slide, which is made out of aluminum. We have a steel insert for the breech, and then also the slide itself runs on steel inserts into the polymer frame. Now, normally I would say that steel on aluminum would be a very bad combination with some long-term issues surely about to arise. However, 22 long rifle is not a terribly high pressure cartridge. So while eventually that aluminum is going to break down running on those steel guide rails, I think it's going to be a very long time before it actually winds up being an issue. Like, it might be something that your grandkids have to contend with, but you in your lifetime will probably not shoot enough rounds to make it a big problem. All right, now we do have a rail dust cover right here, so you can mount your lights or lasers or whatever else that it is that you want to put there. Here in the trigger guard, right here, we have our takedown tabs, which all you pretty much have to do is just pull down on them. Drop the striker and the magazine. Wow, I am terrible at this. Here we go. See, look, when you turn off the safety, drop the striker, and remove the magazine, the slide comes apart. Who would have guessed? And then it's also theoretically just as easy to put it back on. It pretty much just snaps back in how it is that it came off. So there we go. The gun is reassembled. Now, of course, there's more parts than taking apart the slide and all that kind of stuff. I just find it very interesting that those tabs pretty much just have the slide roll off. That's not something that you typically see in semi-autos. Our slide catch is located right here, directly in line with the firer's thumb or firing side thumb. It is not ambidextrous. Now, is it a slide stop or is it a slide release? This is a conversation that I don't generally like to get involved with because I think it's silly. It's kind of like the glass is half full or half empty type conversation. In my opinion, it comes down to, am I trying to fill it or am I drinking out of it? So in this case, do you just want to use this in order to lock back the gun in order to be able to show clear or remove a malfunction or something along those lines, or do you use it as a part of your reload? That's all the real question is here, and either is an acceptable response. I myself am not a big fan of running the slide release, preferring to overhand rack, not because of some outdated belief that gross motor movements are the only thing that matter in gunfights or anything along those lines, as much as it works with everything that I have. The slide is always in the same location, whereas when it comes to the slide release, I have a lot of guns with them in different locations, and since I train around a lot of platforms, I've just gone ahead and made that a refinement. However, what's really important to point out is that the slide release reload is the faster reload. Once you get that methodology down, it is the faster way to get back into the fight. So in this case, with this being accessible with the firing hand's thumb, that's a pretty good setup. If I were to go back to running slide releases, this is where I would want my slide release to be placed at. That way I can conduct all the necessary fighting functions with my strong hand should I need to do so. So release the magazine, operate the safety, and then also release the slide. Now, speaking of safety, we do have an ambidextrous thumb type safety, very similar to that of a 1911, but you can rack the slide with the safety in the on position, which is not necessarily the case with a lot of different handguns out on the market. Our trigger guard is squared off if you're somebody who grips the front of the trigger guard. However, it's not textured, just to throw that out there. Our trigger. So our trigger, honestly, is very indicative of a lot of different striker-fired triggers out there. So you have this kind of mushy take-up, you get to a pretty good wall, and then the release is sharpish. It's not the sharpest release that I've ever felt in a striker-fired handgun, but it's better than a lot of the ones that are out there. Our reset takes you slightly in front of the wall, so you got a little bit more mush to come through before you're back on the wall. And then you're break is relatively crisp. Our magazine release is located at the heel of the trigger guard. Something that I've noticed about this is that this little bit of fencing that we have right here actually kind of gets in the way of releasing the magazine. So I feel it very solidly underneath my thumb every time I come back to release the magazine. And it hasn't stopped me from releasing the magazine as much as I notice that it is present. Whereas like the fencing around the magazine release on an AR-15, I've never really noticed, but I know it's there. Now our grip, we can kind of see here that our grip has kind of an odd contour to it. So it kind of bows into the trigger guard here, which is kind of weird. And then it has this very much so kind of humpback shape to it, as well as an almost M16A2 style grip bump for your fingers to kind of wrap around. Now, if you look at the profile from the back, you can see that it tapers up very skinny near the top and then kind of bows out a little bit to fill the palm. Same kind of deal with how this bump comes back here, the idea being to nestle securely into the hand. The texturing on this handgun isn't that much to write home about. However, it is a 22. It's not necessarily trying to climb out of your hand, so I don't think good texturing is necessarily a make it or break it for this handgun. Ergonomics wise, I did have a tendency to present this handgun a touch low. However, it was something that I can compensate for by keeping my lower fingers loose, which is something that I generally try to do. It's just one of those things that if you put me under pressure, I will choke the gun. And that is when I really notice that the gun has a tendency to dip down, is whenever I death grip it. Now, at the bottom of the magazine well, we have these cutouts here in order to be able to strip a magazine should there be some sort of malfunction that was precluding you from being able to release it. There's something like this built into a lot of different guns. You just may not necessarily recognize it for what it is. The magazines for this handgun comes with 3, and they are made entirely out of polymer, which is, well, plastic, because this is not the same material that goes into this grip, and I am a little bit concerned about the longevity of these magazines. Now, what I find interesting about these magazines is that they are 16-round magazines, and that was one of the things that really drew some interest from me when it comes to this handgun, because for the most part, 22 semi-automatic handguns out of the market don't have that impressive of a capacity. This was one of the higher capacity options out of the market until the recent SIG product that has a 20-round capacity magazine, which should have been the norm at this point. It completely blows my mind that it has taken this long to get higher capacity 22 and long rifle magazines instead of sticking with mostly just 10-round handgun mags. Why? Why is that a thing? How is it that it took Taurus to figure out that you could kind of do a staggered stack magazine with a rimmed 22 long rifle casing? It just boggles my mind. And I guess there previously wasn't a whole lot of interest, but this is a pretty interesting feature of this handgun. Now, you also have these tabs here so that you can pull down on the spring to aid you in the loading process, which is pretty typical with 22 long rifle magazines. All right, guys, that's features. How does it shoot?
Sharpie on my butt. I was gonna give you Sharpie. And see this right here? You got a pen or something so we can mark on it?
For the shooting portion of this, we're going to break this into kind of 2 different facets. We're going to talk about this gun unsuppressed, and then we're going to talk about it with the suppressor added. So, unsuppressed. I found this handgun absolutely fantastic to get pretty fast shot strings in with very tight groupings. We're talking kind of just rattling off the rounds at a pace that I was comfortable with and able to stay on the sights with it. like riding my sights and all that kind of stuff, and I was getting right around 1-inch groups with this handgun at 3 to 7 yards, kind of combat distances and all that kind of stuff. So the handgun is plenty accurate, that's for sure. This is a kind of heavy profile barrel, which I don't necessarily think is all that big of a deal in a 22, let alone in a handgun, but something contributed to this thing's accuracy overall. Now the sights, something that I noticed about the sights is that they're quite low, kind of like combat sights, but they're adjustable like competition sights. Myself personally, for a competition handgun, I wouldn't mind having a little bit taller sights and then greater contrast between my sights. The 3 white dots setup is just not that interesting to me. This strikes me, and I've seen this in a couple other handguns that have recently come out on the market. This strikes me as somebody trying to put a middle ground between competition style sights and combat style sights, where you'll see adjustable rear sights, but then some sort of, perhaps high visibility arrangement, but still very small, so as to not snag on things when coming out of the holster or anything along those lines. I personally think this should have taller sights on it. Or at the very least, I'm not a big fan of fiber optics, but I could understand this being a competition handgun having a fiber optic front sight. I could see somebody preferencing that, and that would make more sense to me at this point. Reliability was 100%. I had absolutely no malfunctions. I've pretty much exclusively shot this handgun with the Winchester white box, that 333 grain stuff, but I've had no issues with it, so I do appreciate that. When it comes to magazine changes, it's actually pretty easy to be able to index the magazines on this handgun. I didn't really find a lot of issue with reloads when it came to this pistol. All right, now let's talk about it suppressed. So, of course, suppressors are fun, guys. However, suppressors kind of have a time and a place, and I'm not entirely convinced that they have an inherent superiority in all things as much as they're just cool. Now, cool is a factor, and with a suppressor, this thing does look pretty cool. But how did it impact the shooting dynamic? Well, first off, if we're talking about it being quiet, I was running high velocity 22 long rifle ammunition out of it. So it wasn't as quiet as it could have been if I ran subsonics, but I don't own any subsonic 22 long rifle ammunition. I have no interest in buying it just for the purpose of maybe making this quiet when I go out to the range with my friend. So for that, we ran high velocity stuff from it. What I found interesting was that I did see a change in my groupings whenever I shot this handgun suppressed. And it kind of threw me off for a second because I never really considered some of the repercussions of placing a suppressor on a handgun up until I started developing this for review with the owner. So I noticed very rapidly that my groups were opening up quite a bit. I started really digging into the shooting dynamic on this and trying to understand what it was that was going on, because it would be far too easy to say, well, the suppressor caused a point of impact shift, which maybe it did a little bit, but I don't think it really accounted for the wider groups. So what I started to notice was that with this lightweight of a handgun, because this is incredibly lightweight, when you throw a suppressor on it, that drastically changes the balance point of the handgun. And it changed my recovery time to get back on the sights. Now, that's not to say that I wasn't getting on the sights to begin with, as much as there was more play induced into the sights as I went through that shot string, because the gun had kind of switched over into a sort of seesaw with that suppressor on it. So what I found when I slowed down, really worked the trigger, and really rode my sights, I could close those groups up quite a bit. And probably more so had I spent more time working with the gun. But this is somebody else's property. I do want to make sure I get it back to whoever it is that I borrow it from whenever it is that I borrow it. So I always make sure to not spend too much time with the guns that I borrow. It was just, really, the culmination here is that if you place a suppressor on a lightweight handgun, you might see some change in its performance accuracy-wise, to where I could not shoot this at the same pace unsuppressed as I could suppressed in order to be able to get the same results. Now, does that mean that there's something wrong with the gun or the suppressor or anything along those lines? No, it's just something that it's just data that you have to take into account if you're wanting this for a suppressor host. All right, guys, that's shooting. What are my recommendations when it comes to this handgun? Would I recommend this for duty use? Absolutely not. First off, 22 long rifle is not a suitable duty type cartridge, not for somebody who's potentially going to have to use this firearm to defend themselves or others in a duty type sense. This could perhaps fit your kind of like James Bond, CIA, assassination type aesthetic or something along those lines, but for the vast majority of people, that's not what they're doing with their legally purchased handguns. You could also see someone make an argument for some unit needing it for like sentry elimination or something along those lines, but I don't think I would choose a 22 for that because that would be its only purpose at that point. And I don't really have, in a fluid and dynamic mission, I don't have a lot of interest in having one-trick ponies with me. Like you got to really have a need for something in a niche type format like that in order to constitute the space, the weight, and all those types of things. Now, in addition to that, with the optics plate mounted, you're going to have some trouble finding holsters that will fit this gun, especially holsters that are approved for duty use. You're picking from a much smaller pool. Now, if you were to remove this optic plate, I'm not entirely sure how that would impact your holster options, but it should positively impact them overall. All right, so what about for home defense, self-defense type use? Once again, first off, holsters because of the optic plate, but an able-bodied person who is capable of handling a more potent firearm should do so if they're looking for a self-defense, home defense option. Now, if we're talking about somebody who doesn't have, be it because of injury or illness or whatever it is that it may be, who doesn't have the full ability of a, healthy, vibrant person, then yes, this handgun wouldn't be a bad choice for home defense. The slide is light and easy to rack, the magazine capacity is high, the recoil is low, and the ability to be able to add a suppressor, an optic, and a light would be really fantastic as a home defense option for somebody who still has a right to defend themselves regardless of what type of condition their body is in. So, for home defense type uses in that very niche category, I could recommend this. But for any able-bodied person, no, absolutely not. Well, what about competition type use? Well, it's in the name. This would be fantastic for 22 competitions, especially with an optic added on and all that kind of stuff. This would be so much fun in 22 competitions where the ammunition's cheap to begin with. I could really see this doing very well. You're still going to have a little bit of an issue with the holster, but I bet you it's easier to find competition-rated holsters than it is to find duty-rated holsters. Well, what about as a hunting option? Well, that comes down to local laws. If the capacity of this is not going to be problematic or the barrel length is not going to be a problem, then I could see this as a good hunting option. It might even be a good use to have it as a suppressed hunting option. In addition to that, dispatching animals that you've trapped or something along those lines, 22s are frequently chosen for that. And though I think this is maybe a little bit overdeveloped for that type of purpose, this has much better purposes that it could be employed for, this wouldn't be a bad use for that. Or that wouldn't be a bad use for this. I guess either statement was correct, but oh well. Well, what about like a woods gun? I'm out bebopping around, some property that I have or something along those lines in an area where it's legal for me to do so. Well, this wouldn't be a bad choice overall. I mean, if you found a holster that worked with it and all that kind of stuff and you wanted to use it to, plink, maybe take some pot shots at some stumps or something along those lines, this wouldn't be a bad choice for that, for fun. But if you're talking about it for actual use against, let's say you live in Alaska or something along those lines, and you're like, Murph, would this be a good idea for me to just walk around the wilderness in Alaska with? I would say no, because bears. It's going to take a whole lot of 22 to put a bear down. You probably don't have that kind of time before your lunch. All right, guys, those are my recommendations when it comes to this firearm. Would I buy it? And the answer is no. And this might be kind of surprising to some people because I did kind of speak pretty positively of this handgun overall. There are two reasons that I wouldn't buy this. The first kind of comes back to my previous bias. Now, something that has been previously discussed with Taurus handguns has been some issues with quality control. And it is something that you have to keep an eye on with all manufacturers. That's why you should be watching reviews and getting into the nitty gritty about guns before you just run out and purchase them because there happens to be one on sale. Something that I observed with this handgun and has actually been noted in other articles that I've read is that sometimes the roll pins back out. This roll pin located right here in the grip has kind of been slowly backing out on me after range trips, and I've been pressing it back into place. That's something that kind of bugs me. Now, is that going to be a problem to the average person? No. Even a competition shooter or something along those lines. It's too easy to come back through, check that every once in a while, press it back into place, and then go about your day. It's never fallen out. It's not like it's even worked itself halfway out or anything along those lines. It's always just a little tiny nubbin, just enough for me to be able to detect with a finger. It has been poking out, and then I come through, press it back in with like the magazine base plate or something like that, and then it's off to the races. However, it's just something that I've noticed, and it kind of confirms my previous misgivings. And the fact that other people have noticed this as well is something that, again, kind of gives me some concerns. But the other reason I wouldn't pick one up is that I have very limited interest in a 22 suppressor host. Now, in previous years, a couple years ago, if you'd asked me about this, I would be like, absolutely, I want this. I was looking for a 22 suppressor host at the time, and then you combine that with the 16-round magazine and the optics plate and all that kind of stuff, and this would have been right up my alley in 2019. However, in recent years, and I even bought a 22 to turn into a suppressor host. However, I wound up falling up short on actually pulling the trigger on that project because ultimately, with the cost of suppressors, the cost of the tax stamp and all that kind of stuff, a 22 suppressor host just isn't that interesting to me. Especially because I have a very limited interest in suppressors on handguns to begin with outside of a giggle factor. Like, yes, they're very fun, but they hold very little practical use for me, which is kind of its own video all by itself. I don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole. So, I would not purchase this. However, let's say that it was 2019. I got this gun in my hand and was like, yes, I'm going to do it. What would I do with this? Well, I would get an optic, first off. Probably like a Leopold Delta Point Pro. I've been kind of crushing on those lately. And then I would go with a suppressor, probably a silencerco sparrow like the owner has on this one. And then I would get some kind of light, and then it would be my crazy little like tactical assassin's pistol that is never going to get used for its full purpose. Another thing that I really like about this handgun, by the way, guys, it's kind of going on a little bit of a diatribe here, but it kind of looks like a Star Wars blaster, especially if you added like a light and an optic to this handgun. It would look like something that you would be carrying as you like fought alongside Din Djarin in The Mandalorian or something like that. It's kind of a neat little thing there, but definitely not enough to increase my interest in purchasing it. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.